In the late summer of 1944, the war in Europe was unraveling faster than anyone could control. German armies were retreating, communications were collapsing, and entire units were surrendering without orders. Amid that chaos, a small group of German women were captured near the Channel coast, not fighters in the traditional sense, but clerks, nurses, and signal auxiliaries pulled from collapsing rear positions. Within weeks, they were placed on a transport ship bound west. They had no idea where they were going, only that the ocean ahead felt endless. 1. Arrival in an unknown land when the trucks finally rolled through the gates of an American POW facility in the southern United States. The women braced themselves for what came next. They had been warned for years that American captivity meant humiliation, cruelty, and revenge. Instead, they were met by order and quiet. The camp was small, almost understated. Wooden barracks, chain-link fencing, watchtowers occupied but not menacing. The heat was overwhelming, heavy, and damp in a way none of them had experienced in Europe. They instinctively formed ranks as they disembarked, uniforms straightened by habit alone. Discipline had survived where everything else had collapsed. An American officer read instructions through an interpreter. Her voice was neutral, professional, no threats, no insults. That alone unsettled them. 2. The women behind the uniforms among the prisoners was a former radio operator who had spent years relaying coded messages from dimly lit bunkers. Her fingers still twitched unconsciously, as if listening for signals that no longer existed. Beside her stood a medical assistant who had worked through endless casualty lists, stitching wounds while supplies vanished and patients grew thinner each month. They were not ideologues. They were not decision-makers. They were workers caught inside a collapsing system, yet the uniforms erased that distinction. 3. Life inside the camp. The first nights passed slowly. The barracks were basic but clean. Mattresses were thin yet softer than ship bunks. The women spoke quietly, sharing fears they had not voiced aloud since capture. Meals were the first true shock. Bread white, soft, unlimited, meat served daily, vegetables fresh, not boiled into submission. At first, many refused to finish their plates. It felt wrong, suspicious, almost offensive. Back home, civilians survived on ration cards that barely sustained life. Here in enemy custody, food was abundant. No explanation made sense. 4. Watching the enemy up close, the American guards confused them even more. Some were women, some were black. Some spoke casually, laughed, carried themselves without rigid hierarchy. Everything contradicted what they had been taught. One guard in particular watched the prisoners closely, not with hostility but curiosity. She had expected monsters. Instead, she saw exhaustion, fear, and restraint. Women barely older than herself, carrying a war they had not designed. Neither side knew how to behave toward the other, so they kept distance. At first, 5 cracks in the wall. Weeks passed. Routines formed. Work assignments remained light: kitchen assistance, sorting supplies, basic maintenance. No forced labor, no shouting. The prisoners noticed something else. No one rushed them. Illness was treated promptly. Weakness was not punished. Mistakes were corrected calmly. Slowly, conversations began. First through interpreters, then through gestures, then through shared glances that said more than words ever could. The wall between captor and captive did not fall all at once. It thinned. 6. The moment that stayed one afternoon, dessert appeared on the serving table. It was unfamiliar, cold, foamy. A sweet drink topped with ice cream. Some of the women laughed nervously. Others stared at it as if it were experimental equipment. A few whispered that it might be a trick, but when someone finally tasted it, the reaction was unmistakable. Not joy, not relief, recognition. This was not deception, this was excess. And excess required a system strong enough to sustain it. That realization unsettled them more than hunger ever had. 7. After the war, when the war ended, repatriation began slowly. Some women returned to Germany carrying memories that no one at home wanted to hear. Others made different choices. A few married Americans they had met indirectly through the camp, brothers, cousins, acquaintances. Some returned years later as immigrants, not prisoners. They learned English, built careers, raised families, but they never forgot that place. 8. Decades later, more than 20 years after the war, a small group of those women met again, this time by choice, not force. They gathered around a restaurant table in an American city, their accents softened by years abroad. They spoke of children, of work, of lives rebuilt, and eventually they spoke of the camp. Of the heat, the silence, the food that made no sense. One woman raised her glass and laughed. "We thought it was propaganda," she said. "We were wrong." Another nodded. "It wasn't the defeat that changed us," she replied. "It was being treated like we would survive." 9. What remains history often records wars through battles and leaders. Through dates and maps and numbers. But wars also end in quieter ways. In camps where prisoners expected cruelty and found restraint. In meals that contradicted everything they had been taught. In small moments that dismantled ideology piece by piece. Those women arrived as prisoners. They left as witnesses, not to victory, not to defeat, but to the truth that power is not only measured by what a nation can destroy, but by what it can sustain, even for its enemies.